The final particular complication for the new priest is the secret of the fraction. The Coptic bread, as I said to you, is unbroken, untouched prior to the consecration. At the words of institution, a slight break is made of it, made in it, at the words he took, broke. But the bread is broken in the fraction in a particularly complex way. The diagram on the top right, yes, was a drawing I did, it's an illustration I did to accompany my paper on the right of the fraction, which if you read you'll realise how complicated it is. The bread has to be broken up in a number of ways, but it has to be broken up in such a way that it can be put back together. And it has to be put back together so the priest can hold it and raise it thus high 3 times in his hand above the paten, with the constant fear that if you haven't done it correctly, you will raise it and it will simply fall apart.
Or a bit will fall out.
A bit will fall out, yes. So the fraction, which can really only be taught using bread, so the teacher will sit the novice down with a half dozen loaves and watch him break the bread repeatedly and repeatedly. Assuming that the lucky novice priest has now worked his way through this, he'll then be instructed in the ritual tradition for the other sacraments. Really, this only involves baptism, because the sacrament of baptism is particularly complicated. Interestingly enough, the other Coptic sacraments are very, very simple and straightforward. The funeral rite, for example, is incredibly simple. Chrismation or confirmation is very simple. Marriage is not complicated at all. The Coptic rite of baptism is particularly difficult. It involves very complex prayers for the consecration of the water, and interestingly enough, after the baptism is completed, prayers for the deconsecration of the water. There are prayers for the water to return to its natural state. The ritual for the consecration of the water done in full would take probably an hour and a half. Many priests, therefore, will do it once, not say the prayer for the return of the water to its natural state, and simply leave the water in the font to be reused, which I must say leads sometimes to water that doesn't strike me as being particularly attractive or healthy. Coptic baptism includes, amongst other things, 36 separate anointings on 36 separate parts of the body. So the priest needs to be able to accurately anoint the child, or the adult in some cases, in a sequence of 36 anointings as part of the conclusion of the baptismal ritual.
Including both urethras, right?
Yes. Yes, that certainly was entertaining. So once all of that's been accomplished, the priest will also then have to, the new priest will then also have to acquire competence in the liturgical year. This is not normally taught as, this is not taught as part of the 40 days, there wouldn't be time enough. But the priest would then normally be expected to spend some time, at least a year, in a parish with a senior, well-instructed priest. Because the Coptic liturgical rites for the seasons are extraordinarily complicated, and there are very substantial volumes, not just for things like Pascha, but for specific days. There is, for example, a ritual known as the Rite of the Apocalypse, which is celebrated on Bright Monday. The ritual volume for that, in English translation, runs to over 300 pages. And the liturgy itself would take at least 3 hours, and involves an extraordinarily complicated series of readings and the lighting of 7 wicks in oil with associated prayers. So presumably the priest eventually will be able to do all of this well. The Coptic rites for Good Friday, Holy Saturday and Pascha are most extraordinarily beautiful, extraordinarily lengthy and incredibly complex. And unfortunately in many churches now have been seriously simplified, both because priests find the complexity of the ritual tedious and because most people won't attend. I seem to remember a Good Friday would normally start at about 6 a.m. and would end slightly after midnight, but you would have to be back in church at 6 a.m. the following morning for another 12-hour day. Probably one of the most challenging ritual experiences of my life, which occurs in the Good Friday service, is where the priests, standing in front of the sanctuary, prostrate 100 times. Now, the priest who was my teacher was then probably in his 60s, and he had a prayer rope with 100 beads on it to keep count of the prostrations. And we stood side by side in front of a very large congregation and started prostrating. And he just kept going like that. And I found myself increasingly unable to move. He fortunately slowed down, and I finally did the 100 prostrations, but I was certainly not a happy person at the end of it. The new priest would also be expected to be instructed in the Coptic musical tradition. Now, most priests, by the time they are ordained, would have served in the choir in a church and would therefore know something of the musical tradition. The Coptic, as contrasted to the Arabic musical tradition of the church, has almost been lost. In fact, there are whole slabs of it that have simply disappeared. There are liturgical services for which there is now no known music. A lot of the music in Coptic churches these days is, strictly speaking, not Coptic music, it's Arabic music. And if you listen to it, it is very clearly Arabic. If you have never heard Coptic chanting, you wouldn't necessarily recognize the difference, but Coptic chant is quite different to Arabic chant. The musical tradition was almost lost, and it was kept alive into the early 20th century by blind cantors. The tradition was that the men who led the choir in Coptic churches were blind and learnt the music that way. There were two men, two ethnomusicologists, Ernst Newland Smith and Raghbed Mufta, who wandered around tape recording the last of the blind cantors, and they reconstructed as far as they could the Coptic musical tradition. And so it is now possible to hear Coptic chants sung by professional choirs. The only musical instruments permitted to be used in the Coptic liturgy are, oddly enough, the cymbals, you can see a pair there, and the triangle. I couldn't find a photograph of a triangle. That might sound odd, but some who are well trained in Coptic music can create absolutely magical sounds with a pair of cymbals and a triangle. Clearly, in times past, the Coptic musical tradition involved other instruments. There are references in ancient texts to all sorts of other instruments being used, but the Coptic position now is the only instruments that have ever been used are the cymbals and the triangle.
Happy to note they probably skipped that whole guitar folk math thing, which is probably good.
Yes,
that's
never,
terrible.
Yes, absolutely never done, no.
Right.
Though there is evidence that at some stage lyres were used in Coptic instruments, so you would have had stringed instruments, but not
Yeah.
the sort of kumbaya variety.
Thank God.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, I appreciate that what I've said may have disappointed those who expected more exciting revelations about some secret Coptic tradition, so let me address some of those possible issues. It is often claimed that there is some secret theology taught secretly, particularly in Coptic monasteries in remote places. There's no evidence known to me of any secret Coptic tradition, although claims have existed and long been promoted. For example, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky claimed that one of her teachers was the otherwise unknown Copt Paulos Metamon. Various odd organisations have claimed to have access to secret teachings from within the Coptic tradition and to have found, sometimes with obscure references to the great catechetical school of Alexandria, the teachings of esoteric Christianity in the deserts of Egypt. Coptic theology has always been extremely conservative. Indeed, it could be said that for many centuries there was no Coptic theology. The Church lost its tradition of theologians and theological schools after the Muslim invasion. And so there are whole centuries where there really is no Coptic theological writing at all. Even today, the level of theological education required of candidates for ordination could best be described as that of a mid-level Sunday school teacher. There are Coptic theological colleges, but they would not be called Coptic theological colleges by the average theological college. In modern times, Coptic theology has been far more influenced by American Protestants than by any other source, including Orthodoxy generally. The influence of Protestant missionaries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries have been considerable, particularly under the late Pope Shenouda, who reigned from 1971 to 2012, an extraordinarily long period. An almost fundamentalist Protestant approach has been the norm, and any attempt to express alternative views has been subject to strong opposition. Coptic monasteries are regularly visited by hundreds, if not thousands, of pilgrims. If any unusual, let alone unorthodox, secret teachings were being offered, this would have been quickly made known to church authorities and would have been enthusiastically suppressed. There have been some controversies regarding particular theological teachings in some Coptic monasteries, most notably in modern times in relation to the monastery of St Macarius in the Wadi al-Natrun and the teaching of its late head, Father Matta al-Miskin, better known in the West as Matthew the Poor. His teachings about some matters, particularly the Orthodox doctrine of theosis or divinization, brought him into conflict with Pope Shenouda, and both Pope Shenouda and Metropolitan Bishoy, the secretary of the Synod, published denunciations of Matta al-Miskin, although never referring to him by name. They said interesting things like, "There is a monk who teaches wrongly," and everyone knew to whom they were referring. Secondly, the publication of, inter alia, the Nag Hammadi text has led to some claim that perhaps within remote Coptic monasteries a secret Gnostic tradition continued. Again, I've seen no evidence to support this. There certainly are elements of contemporary Coptic theology which might be attributed to some Gnostic influence, notably a sort of dualism or Manichaeism, contrasting things spiritual from the world, the flesh and the devil, and a somewhat morbid pseudo-asceticism. This seems much more the product of 19th and early 20th century Protestant influences than anything more ancient. Third, although there was obviously a Coptic folk tradition of magical rituals, relatively recently popularised in ancient Christian magic, Coptic texts of ritual power, a wonderful title, the use of the term Coptic to imply that such traditions had a formal connection with the Coptic Orthodox Church is simply wrong. In the same way that claims, for example, that Sicilian folk traditions are formally associated with the Roman Catholic Church, or Greek Orthodox traditions about the evil eye are part of Greek Orthodoxy. They are simply folk traditions. Ancient Christian magic was largely old news. It had been preceded by the work of people like Winifred Blackman in her book The Fellaheen of Egypt in 1927, and Ethel Dryar's Water into Wine in 1956. The extent to which rituals from the Pharaonic era were carried over into Coptic Orthodox tradition and more or less Christianized remained a controversial topic among scholars. There are scholars who have explored aspects of Coptic ritual that appear to be inherited from Pharaonic times, but there is a fierce debate about this. Finally, there have been and there are what might be thought of as secret, as in the sense of now forbidden and therefore not to be discussed, Coptic religious rituals. The three most significant such rituals were prohibited in the reign of the last Patriarch, His Holiness Pope Shenouda III. They were the rite of the lifting of the mat, the rite of Abu Tabu, and the rite of the jar. And I thought for your entertainment I would talk about these by way of conclusion. The rite of the lifting of the mat, now absolutely forbidden, was based on the popular belief that on the 40th day after death, the Archangel Michael weighed the good and bad deeds of the deceased person, after which he or she was assigned to their post-mortem state. The title of the ritual refers to the custom of removing the mats on which the mourners sat. Traditionally in Coptic funerals, people sit on mats, the mourners sit on mats on the floors. After a range of prayers, the priest sprinkled the room which had been occupied by the deceased person with water, and sprinkled the house with water and salt. It is said, and my own experience confirms that that some more devoutly traditionalist Copts will make generous contributions to priests still willing to violate the ban on the right for their deceased family members. The rite of Abu Tabu is indeed a very curious one, and now also banned. It's a Coptic ritual used as a remedy against hydrophobia and is performed for someone who has been bitten by a rabid dog. After various prayers, 7 prepubescent boys go round the person for whom the rite is being performed in a ring 7 times, chanting. A deacon holds unleavened bread in his mouth, and this is taken by the priest and placed in the lap of the person for whom the rite is being performed. This is repeated with cheese and dates. Each of the 7 children then give the priest a piece of unleavened bread, then cheese and dates, on which the person for whom the rite is being done is required to breakfast over 7 days, drinking wine and water brought from the church. The person is then anointed with apocalypse oil, which has been blessed in the apocalypse service on the night of Good Friday, and will be healed as a result of the prayers of the great saint Abu Tabu. Abu Tabu, curiously enough, is completely unknown in the Coptic Synaxarion and doesn't actually appear anywhere in Coptic history. He appears to have been conflated with a saint known as Therapon, and this does appear to be something that's a legacy from Pharaonic times. There is indeed a single church dedicated to Saint Therapon. This ritual is clearly quite old. The manuscripts of it have been found going back to the 19th century, and presumably that suggests it was still being used then. And there certainly are accounts of it being performed in the early 20th century. But as I said, it has now been banned, and it's not permitted to even include a translation of it in the Coptic service book. If any of you fear that you've been bitten by a rabid dog, I have a copy of the ritual. In the and finally the rite of the jar, which is another peculiar one, now banned. In the late 8th to 14th century, many Copts and converts publicly blasphemed and apostatized in an attempt to secure their execution or martyrdom, as you do. However, Copts also converted in significant numbers to Islam, voluntarily or under pressure. Some of those who did so later sought to return to the church. A ritual was developed in the ritual of the rite of the jar, which is a quasi-rebaptism, through which such converts were received back into orthodoxy. It's a liturgical procedure involving water to effect the solemn reconciliation in the Coptic Church of an apostate. And the ritual, interestingly enough, refers to an apostate, whether the apostasy is by denial of the faith or by defilement with a man or a female. That latter phrase is nowhere clearly explained. It does not appear in any of the printed liturgical texts or books of the Coptic Orthodox Church, but exists in a few 19th century manuscripts, and so was practiced at least until that period, even though now it is not mentioned at all and is totally forbidden. The Coptic Orthodox Church provides, albeit in tragically diminishing form, a rare opportunity to see a living manifestation of some of the secret traditions of earliest Christianity. Within the Church itself, there is very sadly not the slightest interest in the history and development of its liturgy, and the subject is of such obscurity that few outside the Coptic Church have shown any interest, or the diligence necessary to pursue the subject. The full, complicated ritual tradition of the Coptic liturgy and the secret tradition is slowly fading into obscurity, as fewer and fewer teachers remain who can properly teach it, and fewer young priests appear who have any interest in learning it. Thank you.